Via Virgine gaudete.
Sacrosanctum Concilium, Chapter 1, Part 3, Section D. Norms for adapting the liturgy to the culture and traditions of the peoples. Paragraph 37. Even in the liturgy, the Church has no wish to impose a rigid uniformity in matters which do not implicate the faith or the good of the whole community. Rather does she respect and foster the genius and talents of the various races and peoples. Anything in these people's way of life which is not indissolubly bound up with superstition and error, she studies with sympathy, and, if possible, preserves intact. Sometimes, in fact, she admits such things into the liturgy itself, so long as they harmonize with its true and authentic spirit. Provision shall also be made when revising the liturgical books for legitimate variations and adaptations to different groups, regions, and peoples, especially in mission lands, provided that the substantial unity of the Roman Rite is preserved, and this should be borne in mind when drawing up the rites and devising rubrics. Within the limits set by the typical editions of the liturgical books, it shall be for the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority mentioned in Article 22(2) to specify adaptations, especially in the case of the administration of the sacraments, the sacramentals, processions, liturgical language, sacred music, and the arts, but according to the fundamental norms laid down in this Constitution. In some places and circumstances, however, an even more radical adaptation of the liturgy is needed, and this entails greater difficulties. Wherefore, 1. The competent territorial ecclesiastical authority mentioned in Article 22(2) must, in this matter, carefully and prudently consider which elements from the traditions and culture of individual peoples might appropriately be admitted into divine worship. Adaptations which are judged to be useful or necessary should then be submitted to the Apostolic See, by whose consent they may be introduced. 2. To ensure that adaptations may be made with all the circumspection which they demand, the Apostolic See will grant power to the same territorial ecclesiastical authority to permit and to direct, as the case requires, the necessary preliminary experiments over a determined period of time among certain groups suited for the purpose. 3. Because liturgical laws often involve special difficulties with respect to adaptation, particularly in mission lands, men who are experts in these matters must be employed to formulate them. Section E. Promotion of liturgical life in diocese and parish. The bishop is to be considered as the high priest of his flock, from whom the life in Christ of his faithful is in some way derived and dependent. Therefore, all should hold in great esteem the liturgical life of the diocese, centered around the bishop, especially in his cathedral church. They must be convinced that the preeminent manifestation of the Church consists in the full active participation of all God's holy people in these liturgical celebrations, especially in the same Eucharist, in a single prayer, at one altar, at which there presides the bishop surrounded by his college of priests and by his ministers. But because it is impossible for the bishop always and everywhere to preside over the whole flock in his church, he cannot do other than establish lesser groupings of the faithful. Among these, the parishes, set up locally under a pastor who takes the place of the bishop, are the most important, for in some manner they represent the visible church constituted throughout the world. And therefore the liturgical life of the parish and its relationship to the bishop must be fostered, theoretically and practically, among the faithful and clergy. Efforts also must be made to encourage a sense of community within the parish, above all in the common celebration of the Sunday Mass. Section F. The promotion of pastoral liturgical action. Zeal for the promotion and restoration of the liturgy is rightly held to be a sign of the providential dispositions of God in our time, as a movement of the Holy Spirit in His Church. It is today a distinguishing mark of the Church's life, indeed of the whole tenor of contemporary religious thought and action. So that this pastoral liturgical action may become even more vigorous in the Church, the Sacred Council decrees. It is desirable that the competent territorial ecclesiastical authority mentioned in Article 22(2) set up a liturgical commission to be assisted by experts in liturgical science, sacred music, art, and pastoral practice. So far as possible, the Commission should be aided by some kind of institute for pastoral liturgy, consisting of persons who are eminent in these matters, and including laymen as circumstances suggest. Under the direction of the above-mentioned territorial ecclesiastical authority, the Commission is to regulate pastoral liturgical action throughout the territory, and to promote studies and necessary experiments wherever there is question of adaptations to be proposed to the Apostolic See. For the same reason, every diocese is to have a commission on the sacred liturgy under the direction of the bishop for promoting the liturgical apostolate. Sometimes it may be expedient that several dioceses should form between them one single commission, which will be able to promote the liturgy by common consultation. Besides the commission on the sacred liturgy, every diocese, as far as possible, should have commissions for sacred music and sacred art. These three commissions must work in closest collaboration. Indeed, it will often be best to fuse the three of them into one single commission. Hello, and welcome back, everybody, to our reading and discussion of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Today we continue with Sacrosanctum Concilium, moving into the 37th paragraph into the 46th paragraph, right before chapter 2. So we're finishing up chapter 1 today in our discussion. So we're making progress. I'm joined again with Dan. How are you today, sir?
I am doing well, and I'm super excited. We're finally gonna finish chapter one. It's great. It's a long chapter. It's like one third of the document, I think, but we're finally at the end.
Before we move in, I just kind of wanted to kind of sum up the entire chapter here. And really, I think if you have any input, I think so far what Sacrosanctum Concilium is going for here, what it seems like anyway, is the talking about the, it's the discussion of the principle of subsidiarity as it relates to the church and its importance. And it's always been an important thing in Catholicism, but it's more of like what Sacrosanctum Concilium seems to be doing is nuancing on it and kind of painting the picture in more detail and kind of like drawing the guidelines, the boundaries, like what you can do, what you can't do, and why it's important in terms of relating to the people culturally. Would you say it's accurate?
No, I completely agree. I think we started with there's a lot of issues going on in the church with the increase in secularism and the problems of clericalism, and we see subsidiarity in. Although it's not mentioned by name yet in Sacrosanctum Concilium, I'm not sure if it will be. We definitely see it with this greater focus, on the role of the bishop at the center of determining these liturgical decisions.
Right. It's really what Catholicism really is. It's top down in terms of hierarchy, but it's also, there's a lot of delegation. There's a lot of, um, you know, a lot of that sort when it comes into it. And I think this is a good transition into our first section here, section D, the norms for adapting the liturgy to the culture and traditions of the people. And if you know anything about Catholicism, you know that this is not something new. And this is kind of why I wanted to highlight that point in the beginning, because this is something Catholicism's always done. I think the famous example is the Christmas tree. It was There a lot of people talk about it. It was this pagan thing that because it's not something that's necessarily superstitious or idolatrous in any certain way. And so taking something from the culture of the land that you're evangelizing and Christianizing it, as it were. I think that's basically what this 37th paragraph is saying here in terms of the liturgy. The church, what the council says, it doesn't want to enforce rigidity as it uh, as it is with the liturgy. And I agree with that. You don't want to go into a culture where you know you're going into a culture where there's a bunch of natives and you're trying to celebrate the Latin Mass or something like that. It's just trying to enforce your culture on another culture. It's just
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
Exactly. And sort of to build on that point, I mean, we see in this norms section, right, it says, that the bishop should carefully and prudently consider which elements from the traditions and culture of individual people might be appropriately be admitted into divine worship, right? And ultimately, the Apostolic See grants this power to that territorial ecclesial authority, aka the bishop or conference of bishops, right, to enact this purpose. So, one example this reminds me of, which is a huge debate and not technically not resolved, but JP2 kind of had his opinion on it, where in the Middle Ages you had Jesuit missionaries sent into China, and they came into China and they started to adapt to their culture. They would incorporate Chinese sort of religious garb into the vestments they would wear when celebrating Mass. They would grow their beards very long in a very sort of traditional Chinese fashion, learn to speak the language, and celebrate liturgy in Chinese. And when word got back to Europe, some Dominicans, were not too happy with these adaptations. There was concern that they had, taken the communion of the saints notion that we have and turned it into worship of the saints, right? So there was accusation that they were committing idolatry. They were adapting so much into Chinese culture that they were losing the core of the faith. And well, this is obviously two huge cultures combining, and I'm sure there were some people, who were going too far in China, and I'm sure that there was definitely legitimacy to these concerns about the Dominicans. I do think we see this tension that has existed in the church, whereas we want to be able to adapt to the culture and bring that culture into worship where we can. Um, but we also need to be very clear in what is the truth that we're presenting. We are presenting Christ, which is not, it's not a European thing. It's not a Chinese thing. If anything, it's a Jewish thing. But it's even beyond that, obviously. So I think it's very important that when we go through this, like the bishop is the key discerner here, and the bishop obviously can be wrong, which is why he must carefully and prudently consider these elements and not just, go with the movement of the times.
And we're going to read, well, we did read more about that today in section F. We'll get there in a second, kind of what the process is for approving these sorts of things. But before we do that, I'll talk about section E a little bit, promotion of liturgical life in diocese and in parish. Um, I didn't have too much to say here. All I know is that the priest is a delegate, an extension of the bishop. That's something I actually was not aware of before. I did have one question, and Dan, you being the theologian among us, I was wondering if
My
you could bring
undergrad theologian.
I was wondering if you could tell us the difference between like a presbyterer. Am I saying that right? A presbyterer and a priest. Is there a difference? Is it just kind of like a change of terminology? Uh, can you talk a little bit about that? And then maybe give your
Sure.
reflection on the section he is too as well. So
Sure, sure. So I'm going to answer it by saying I don't know, especially if we're talking in the early church, right? Like in the letters between, Peter, John, Paul, the first Christian letters that are in the New Testament. Like we see this presbyter and we see bishop, but we also see, and obviously the apostles, but we see these presbyters and deacons, and exactly what their role look like. Again, it's really hard to parse and know for sure. Like we're all presbyters in the New Testament priests, we're all deacons, sacramentally ordained role, that we understand them to be today. There's a lot of things that haven't yet been figured out, and there's a lot of obviously debate on this topic. But I will say on the principle and what Sacrosanctum Concilium says here. The first basis is, and I love this in paragraph 41, that the bishop is to be considered as the high priest of his flock, from whom the life in Christ of his faithful in some way derive and is dependent, right? So that's the bishop's really important. And then later on it says, ultimately, where one bishop resides, he's surrounded by his college of priests and ministers, right? And because it's impossible for the bishop to always be everywhere for his whole flock, he establishes these lesser groupings of the faithful. So these parishes, right, get established with some of his priests attending to those parishes. But at the end of the day, all things in the church, all religious orders, right, they find their root in a bishop. Now, for diocesans, it's pretty clear who the bishop is. So for religious orders, for religious groups like Opus Dei, like their main bishop is the Pope, right? That's ultimately, if you go up the Jesuit hierarchy, from the very first Jesuit seminarians, it goes all the way up to the Pope, who happens to be a Jesuit right now. But even if it's not a Jesuit, right, the Pope would be the head bishop. Like all of the religious orders have at their top the bishop, or even if you think about the monasteries, they would also report to the bishop and also the Pope at the height of it. So at the end of the day, everything is rooted in the bishop, and I think the need to have priests really comes out of the growth, the beautiful growth of the church, and the fact that the bishop, cannot attend to all the faithful in his diocese without help from priests and then later deacons.
In this top-down structure, you mentioned the religious orders and diocesan priests, obviously. But religious orders, they tend to have provincials as well. I come from the Carmelite order. I discerned with them for a few years, as you know. And there's the provincial, and even the provincial is the elected, I guess you could say, leader of the order, for lack of a better term. I'm sure there's a better term, I just can't think of it. But
Yeah, yeah,
a few years they serve a period, but even they are answerable to the bishop. They try to work with the bishop and try to figure out what would be a good move for a priest if he's say a Carmelite priest is a pastor at a parish where a bishop is residing, obviously, and they could communicate. But at the end of the day, the priest, excuse me, the bishop is still going to have the final say. And
exactly.
what we're seeing, I think, is a good transition to section F too, because what we're seeing in section F, I said this earlier when you and I were talking. I think it's perhaps the most Vatican II thing so far, because
Yes.
it seems to address two of the major issues that Sacrosanctum Concilium is seeking to solve, so to speak, and that is the issues of clericalism and really nuancing what subsidiarity is. And I feel like it does both of those things in this section. So it's the forming of commissions. And the first time I read through this, I'm like, okay, commissions and committees and people talking in church councils and
Government. Yeah.
yeah, blah blah blah. It's so boring. But what's really interesting here is that it's the council has it decrees in the 43rd paragraph. The Sacred Council decrees these things. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think probably when I first went through this just like a few days ago, I when I saw the word decrees, my ears were like, "Oh, this is important." And part of that might be because, sometimes in arguing with, Protestants, there's important to make a distinction between something that's produced in a council and what's the council decreeing. And so whenever I see the council decrees, my ears are like, "Oh, this is very important."
Mhm.
So, yeah, but then going into it, like there are really, it made me list out like, paragraph 44, 45, 46. I kind of take as those three commissions, right? They say at the end of 46. And it's really interesting because first all the bishops are called to set up a liturgical commission, right? So that they can basically look into liturgy and build suggestions to help address, again, this problem, getting, the lay more involved in the life of the church, right? And how to use liturgy to help function in this manner, or to adapt to liturgy, I should say, in a way that was conducive to functioning. So that's the first point. The second point, which is, I mean, it's mundane but very important, right? That, if there are dioceses that are next to each other, they can kind of work together to establish a commission, pool resources, etc., which it's a very practical concern, but it's a very real one. And then the third one, which is also interesting, is that the Commission on Sacred Liturgy in every diocese should have commissions for sacred art and sacred music. So the way I've understood this is, you come into Mass, right? You have the structure, the place, the physical building, and that's, the beauty, the art. You have the music, and then you have the liturgy. The liturgy is obviously the height, but all these other aspects contribute to it. And it's important for the bishops, again, going just to what we read at the very beginning, to be very prudent and careful in how they discern and decide what should be happening in these liturgy. And more than that, so there's obviously a lot of power being given to the bishop here in setting up these liturgical commissions, but it's not complete, right? Vatican II is not going one extreme to another extreme. It's not going from the, papal infallibility of Vatican I all the way to, spreading out authority of the bishops all over the place, right? It does say here that if after consideration in these liturgical committees, right, or liturgical commissions, I should say, um, if there is some sort of experimentation that is to be done, these adaptations should be proposed to the Apostolic See, right? That's at the end of paragraph 44. So yes, there's a lot of leeway, there's a lot of room bishops are given to work, but their work is important, it's sacred. They can make mistakes, and the lives of their faithful are kind of contingent on it. So this is a very important work, and they're still accountable to Rome, right? They're still accountable to the Vicar of Christ here on earth. So that didn't go away all of a sudden in Vatican II. But I believe these three things really anchor us. We are moving in a direction that is more supportive of subsidiarity, but it doesn't take away the value of the Pope at all. So, yeah, those are my thoughts from here in these sort of decrees that we got at the end of chapter 1.
And I just wanted to highlight how this fights clericalism exactly is, the diocese, they're going to form these commissions. They're going to have discussions with the bishop. The bishop's either going to agree or disagree, but he's going to be held accountable um, to the commission if they do have a legitimate concern or grievance or anything that they will want addressed, or something culturally that could be added to the liturgy, and he just ignores it. But also, let's say it is kind of something that's out in left field. Well, he could take that to the Pope, and the Pope or the Holy See, and they could say, well, no, we don't want that because it's out in left field,
And
essentially.
he ought to take it to the Pope, right? It's not just he
Right.
should, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and if I'm reading this right, he has to.
He has to, yeah.
He has to. He needs that approval from the Holy See. So again, we see how it's fighting clericalism and really highlighting the importance of subsidiarity. And it's quite beautiful. I've learned quite a bit reading through this first chapter of Sacrosanctum Concilium with you,
Yes,
Dan. And
yes.
I am very much excited to continue on. Our next section, we'll be talking more about the sacred mystery of the Eucharist. So now we're getting into the sacrament itself. So before we go, was there anything else you wanted to add?
I think I covered all the points I wanted to address, and yeah, I'm excited to be moving on to chapter 2.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today again, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
Gaudete, Gaudete, Christus Natus ex Maria